Hello, everyone, and welcome to Carpet City Cinema, a Hilo Films podcast. I'm David Weaver, and we start off with announcing that The Last Frankenstein has now added its 9th streaming option to its catalog, which is a platform called Cineverse. We don't have the link up yet on the website. I'll probably get that done in a couple days, but this is a platform that picked us up actually a while ago. So it can take quite a while between the time that we get notified that they have selected our film to the time it actually gets up on the service. In fact, we've had some platforms who accepted us quite a while ago that still don't have us up. But this is one that I kind of just forgotten about, to be honest with you. And then it just kind of came up in a search that this was available there now. And it's pretty cool because it has a pretty wide-ranging selection on the Cineverse platform. And for Frankenstein fans, when you type in Frankenstein, our movie now comes up alongside such cult classics as Lady Frankenstein, the wonderfully enjoyable 70s film with Joseph Cotten and the gorgeous Rosalba Neri, but also Frankenstein's Daughter from 1958, which is the original Frankenstein film that Bob Dix, who plays the patriarch of the Frankenstein family in our movie, that was the other Frankenstein film he appeared in, and one that I enjoyed quite a bit when I've seen that. I really enjoyed that film a lot. So check us out on Cineverse or any other of the options available. Moving over to our fearless producer Jay Leonard and the nonstop express that is his most recent film, Break Glass. Yes, it has been accepted into yet another film festival, which is excellent news. The film will be now playing as part of the Kansas City Underground Film Festival. So big shout out to everyone involved for that. But also pretty exciting is that they played a little while ago at the Jersey Shore Film Festival, and the awards announcements from that event just came out, and it was a sweep, pretty much. It was an amazing response to the movie. They took home the awards for Best Narrative Feature Film, Best Director, Best Female Actor in a Feature Film for Susanna Bourne, Best Male Actor in a Feature Film for Ricky DeRosa, and Best Supporting Actor in a Feature Film for The Last Frankenstein's one and only Jeff Riano. So congrats to everybody there. Big shout out to them. And then this week is when it plays at Buffalo Dreams. So looking forward to hearing from Jay about how that experience goes, because I know he's going to go out west to there for the screening and the Q&A. So looking forward to hearing back from him on that. Sorry to read today that we lost Garth Craven, age 84. And Craven was a person in the film industry who wore several hats. You start seeing his credits pop up in the late 60s into the early 70s working in sound, as a sound editor often, and even received a BAFTA nomination for his work on Joseph Losey's classic The Go-Between, and also worked on such films as Losey's Figures in a Landscape and 3 into 2 Won't Go, which Kino Lorber just put out. Another Losey film he did actually was The Assassination of Trotsky. The bulk of his credits, though, were for editing. And some of the films he cut included When a Man Loves a Woman, Legally Blonde, the Academy Award-nominated Educating Rita, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, which I believe, I could be mistaken, was the only film that Roger Corman produced that earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Screenplay. I know he released some films in the States that were foreign movies that had been nominated, but I think that's the only movie he actually produced that had an Academy Award nomination. And also, there's a handful of credits in Craven's filmography as a second unit director, too. Stuff like Air America with Mel Gibson and Robert Downey Jr. and the Jodie Foster film Carney. But what he's kind of best known for, and the reason that I especially take note of his passing, is because he had both a friendship and a professional relationship with the legendary director Sam Peckinpah, who is one of my all-time favorite directors. And Peckinpah did such films as The Wild Bunch, The Getaway with Steve McQueen, the original Straw Dogs, Packer and Billy the Kid. The first film they worked together on, though, was Straw Dogs, and that was a film on which Craven was the sound editor. And then he also worked on post-production sound on The Getaway, He worked as an editor on Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia, and Convoy. And there's, like many directors, Peckinpah had certain people he were his go-to people in terms of cast and crew. And Craven was definitely one of these people. He pops up on extras, bonus features on Peckinpah product. So just one of those kind of people definitely associated with him. When we also lost, not terribly long ago, I think it was this year, or maybe it's late last year, Gordon Dawson, who was another frequent artistic collaborator of Peckinpah's. So again, this guy is one of my top tier directors. Who, even the films he made that I don't particularly think are great, or his stronger moments, I still see themes and aesthetic in it that really I find interesting and intriguing. And so it's just, again, any of these people who are kind of his tight-knit group, the people who he really knew and worked with a lot, it's definitely sad to see them move on. But 84 years old, a good run for sure. A lot of interesting news in terms of physical media releases. Kind of one of the big stories that came out is that Disney will be putting out on 4K Blu-ray the first and second seasons of The Mandalorian, as well as WandaVision, and I believe the first season of Loki. And the big thing about this is just that maybe it's kind of an indicator that Disney is going to get a little bit more back into physical media. Don't quote me on this, I think this might be the first time any of the Disney Plus original product is hitting physical media. And hopefully they will just not only continue to release their own products, but maybe this will result in them opening up their catalog to license again, as they had in the past. So don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but definitely news that bodes well for the future, we hope, and that there's been a lot of chatter about. But although that's kind of a good news of a more general nature in terms of more specific titles that really popped out, it would be Severin, who's the big winner there. They just had their annual event the other day, the Super Shock Pop-Up Film Festival held in LA. And this is an event they do each year where they screen a handful of movies and then show a bunch of trailers. And these movies and trailers are for upcoming releases, but they don't announce what they are. And they try to get people to swear to secrecy who attend the event. Of course, the titles naturally leak out. And the big one that really is one of the most requested titles for Blu-ray from any label that has yet to hit the high def format is Cemetery Man, and that is one that they are going to be doing presumably in a 4K release. The film came out in 1994, directed by Michele Soavi, who did such horror films classics as The Sect and The Church and Stage Fright, and who had worked under Dario Argento back in the day. Its original Italian title was Della Morte, which is also the name of the Tiziano Sclavi novel on which it was based. Sclavi, the author, also was the creator of the Dylan Dog comic books. And although Cemetery Man pulls more directly from the novel Della Morte, it also does take somewhat from the Dylan Dog works, which they're themselves adapted into a less than successful film in America several years ago, Dylan Dog, Dead of Night. And Rupert Everett stars as the title character, the Cemetery Man, who's an undertaker whose residents at his cemetery have a habit of coming back to life, and he has to dispose with them. And it's interesting, ironic, because Everett's likeness was actually the inspiration for the artistic depiction of the character of Dylan Dog in the original Dylan Dog comic books. The artist had seen Everett in the film Another Country and pulled from that. So it all came full circle when he took on the role. But the film has never had a never had a U.S. Blu-ray release, and it's oft requested. And I don't know whether it's a question of, it's kind of implied that it was a question of sorting out the rights situation. It did have Blu-ray releases in different European countries, but even those, a lot of those, if not all of them, are out of print, and they were taking transfers from the early days of high def from Blu-rays. So for it to make the jump to 4K is going to be quite quite the thing to see, and again, something that's been highly demanded by fans. It is a really entertaining movie, a great mixture of horror and comedy, and also some great practical effects work. So definitely stoked to see Severin tackling that. But also, Severin announced a box set, which is looking pretty sweet. They've done two box sets of films starring Christopher Lee. They called them the Euro Crypt of Christopher Lee because they featured various European films that the horror titan starred in. And they decided to follow up finally with a volume of works starring Peter Cushing, Lee's oft co-star. And this one is called Cushing Curiosities. And just a quick look at the titles in this set. It includes from 1960 the British film Cone of Silence, which is making its Blu-ray debut worldwide. And in that, Cushing plays an airline pilot undertaking an aerial investigation. It has a touch of the courtroom intrigue in it, and features a pretty interesting supporting cast, including Academy Award-winning actor George Sanders from All About Eve, Michael Craig, who is not only an actor, probably best known for Mysterious Island, but also an Academy Award-nominated screenwriter, and Andre Morel, who was Watson to Cushing's Holmes in the 1959 The Hound of the Baskervilles, and also Bernard Lee, M from the James Bond films. And this film is directed by Charles Friend, who started out really being known for as an editor, an Academy Award-nominated editor, but then eventually went on to direct films such as Scott the Antarctic and The Cruel Sea. Next up, also from 1960, is another British delight called Suspect. The plot description put forward by our friends at Severin for this one reads, quote, Peter Cushing leads a team of research biologists who may be plotting to sell government secrets to a foreign power. And this one also has a really top-notch supporting cast. Donald Pleasence of the Halloween films, Oscar nominee Ian Bannon from The Flight of the Phoenix, and an actor better known for his comedic work, Spike Milligan. And this is making its U.S. Blu-ray debut. It had been released over in the U.K. previously by Network Releasing. Of course, we discussed a while back about how Network is now defunct, so that release is out of print. So it's good that this is back in the loop. And on the same disc, it shares with another Network title that they had tackled, The Man Who Finally Died from 1962. And this is one that I really wanted to check out when it was announced, because this was one of the later titles that Network put out in the UK before they went belly up. And again, here from Severin, quote, The Man Who Finally Died sees Cushing in one of his most sinister roles as the family friend of a jazz pianist, Stanley Baker, who uncovers a post-war conspiracy of suspicious deaths, switched identities, and the shocking Nazi past. And so when Network, when the news came out about their demise, I kind of had in my mind these a handful of Network titles that I wanted to make sure I got before they got hard to pick up. And for whatever reason, The Man Who Finally Died, I didn't think of it at the time. It kind of slipped off my out of my mind. And when I went to look for it, eventually it just became impossible to find, even a used copy anywhere, Amazon UK or eBay even. So when I saw that this was going to be part of the Cushing set, I was pretty stoked about that. And this one, again, great supporting cast. You got Mai Zetterling, who was not only a leading lady, but also a really well-known director, and Nigel Green, the famous British character actor from such films as The Mask of the Red Death and The Ruling Class. And this was directed by Quentin Lawrence, who horror fans know him for directing The Crawling Eye. And he also directed Cushing in the bank heist suspense film Cash on Demand, which was made by Hammer. Discs 3 and 4 of this set include the surviving episodes of Cushing's 1968 BBC television series Sherlock Holmes. Now, like we said, Cushing had played Holmes in the 1959 version of The Hound of the Baskervilles that Hammer had made, which also featured, again, Christopher Lee as Henry Baskerville. And in the 80s, one of his last roles that Cushing took on before his retirement was in a television movie, Sherlock Holmes and the Masks of Death, with John Mills, Sir John Mills as Watson. But in between those two, kind of in the middle there, 1968, he did this BBC production, which lasted 16 episodes. Unfortunately, the BBC would basically have these masters for these programs, a lot of their television programs on tape, because as people were familiar with older BBC, vintage BBC product, the exteriors were shot in film, interiors were shot on the video on tape, um, and then they had a tape master that was their main source. And what they did back in the day, before they really realized the possibilities of home media and reruns, the real value that those would have, is that they would just reuse these tapes and tape over what was on them, which is crazy to think about now. But as a result, a lot of older BBC product is lost. It no longer exists. Kind of probably the most famous example being is that a number of the Doctor Who episodes from like the first and second Doctor just don't exist anymore. And every so often, maybe in some far out BBC ancillary station or whatever, a tape will pop up in an attic or something like that. But for the most part, these titles that are lost are just truly lost. In the case of the Sherlock Holmes series, only 6 episodes of the 16 survive intact. Fortunately, this does include the 2-parter adaptation of The Hound of the Baskervilles. But these did have a release on DVD. Severin putting them on Blu-ray, of course, they're from standard definition masters, so you can't really expect much in terms of the quality. But what they're doing by putting them on Blu-ray is they're not only going to be able to fill these discs with lots of great new extras, but they've also kind of restored, a little snippets of the episodes that maybe the quality was just not considered good enough to include in the DVD release. Not much in terms of runtime, I don't believe, but just to try to kind of make it as full as possible, Severin's gone back in and tried to tidy that up and put that stuff back in. They're also including whatever does exist of the lost episodes. There are basically brief scenes or passages of those missing episodes, some of them that still exist. And so they're including all of these on this release. And the role of Watson in the show was played by Nigel Stock, a very well-known British character actor. I was a big fan of the movie The Great Escape growing up with Steve McQueen, and he was one of the key members of the escape team in that film. So definitely looking forward to checking him out as Watson. But yeah, glad that they are including this on the set, despite the fact that a good chunk of the original production is missing. Moving on to disc 5 of this 6-disc set is his Cushing's 1971 horror film Bloodsuckers, co-starring Patrick Macnee and Edward Woodward. And this is a film which has a couple different titles. It's also known as Innocence for the Damned and Freedom Seekers. It's a movie that's had DVD releases. This will be the worldwide Blu-ray debut, but the different DVD releases, they're all different cuts. So there's never been one version with all the footage. And finally, thanks to Severin, this is going to happen. They've scanned the original negative in 2K, and then they found a 35mm print, which had some additional footage. And so now finally you're going to be able to see the film in its entirety. It's a film that kind of had a really rough production, from what I understand. It was directed by Robert Hartford Davis, who had directed Cushing just a few years prior to this in the movie Corruption. Also did Beware My Brethren. But I guess basically at some point, Hartford Davis just left the film before it was really ideally finished in terms of the shooting, and they just went with what they had. The producers went with whatever footage they was shot to complete the movie. But I have not seen this film. I had it in a Something Weird video box set. I never got around to checking it out, partly because I had read about the different cuts, so I was like, I'll put this on the back burner until I can kind of figure out which one to watch. But now it'll be pretty cool to see this in its entirety. And a really interesting thing about this is that they're also going to include with it a short film that Hartford Davis shot in the early 60s called Stranger in the City. So stoked for that too. And then final film on the set, disc 6, and this is the one that I guess Severin really was pushing to get this set brought to life for, to make sure that this film could be included, is from 1974, a film called Tender Dracula. It's a mixture of horror and comedy, somewhat. A French film, and the description that they put forth is, Quote, when horror's biggest star, Peter Cushing, announces his retirement from the genre, two dimwit screenwriters and a pair of sexy actresses are dispatched to the actor's castle for a lavish farce de horreur érotique. Or is that erotique? Violence, whipping, orgies, tender romance, and a devilishly dignified performance by Cushing, even while spanking the bare bottom of French starlet Miu Miu. End quote. So apparently this is the only time that Cushing ever played a vampire on screen. And the supporting cast includes Alida Valli, who fans of horror know her from Suspiria and Inferno, and Eyes Without a Face, but she also goes way back to films like The Third Man and Senso, the Luchino Visconti movie. But this also is a worldwide Blu-ray debut, scanned in 2K from the original negative, and the director of this film is actually still with us, Pierre Grunstein, and this was actually the only film he directed because he's better known as a producer and has produced some pretty big films. Roman Polanski's Tess, he did much more recently than that, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. So pretty stoked that this is finally going to get some love. So that's the entire six disc set. Lots of commentary tracks, lots of interviews included. There's also a 200-page book by Jonathan Rigby, the historian. So Severin really owned the week in terms of new announcements. And the cool thing about this too is they just kind of dropped the announcement. It wasn't even, I don't think there's even any kind of like heads up about this. And they have a podcast. Check it out if you ever can. I think it's just called the Severin Films Podcast. And then when they have these new announcements, they really do a deep dive into what's on the set, and they get some guests onto the podcast. So when I see these new releases come out from them, I'm almost as excited for the podcast episode as for the actual product, because they just really do a great job of diving into it. So definitely check that out if you can too. And a little further off, it's more of a tease from one of the labels coming from Classic Flicks. Is a movie I've wanted to see for some time. It's a 1951 film, suspense movie called Cause for Alarm, starring Loretta Young. And basically in the movie, her husband, played by Barry Sullivan, is an invalid who suspects that she's having an affair with their doctor, which she's not. But he also thinks that they're going to try to kill him. And he writes this down and then this ends up dying anyways, which then, of course, leads to definitely some problems for Young and the doctor, played by Bruce Cowling. The movie, I had heard about this movie some time ago. I don't think there was really any kind of either no release or no decent release. But aside from like the idea of it being this kind of suspense film that from this era, that kind of intrigues me on its own, it was also a movie directed by Tay Garnett, who's a director whose work such as The Postman Always Rings Twice with John Garfield and the great World War II movie Bataan. He's a director whose work has interested me just from his involvement. So Classic Flicks, they have not set any kind of release date for this or anything, but they did tease that they are working on it, and there is on the YouTube a brief snippet of some of their scan work on the film. So hopefully it'll be out by the end of the year. It'd be cool to find this under the Christmas tree. But yeah, that's Cause for Alarm with Loretta Young. All right, and now it's on to the movie of the week, which this time around is from 1998, the aquatic monster movie Deep Rising, directed by Stephen Sommers. In high school, my best friend, he had for a while had an interest in pursuing a career in visual effects. And so he used to get this magazine, I can't remember the name of it, but it was a pretty heavy-duty, thick publication. And I can remember that when this movie came out, he showed me the issue of that mag that covered this film, and he was really hopped up about it. And he, on a side note, ended up going to a career in immigration and customs enforcement, so close enough, I guess, to VFX. But my recollection of this film, which this was the first time watch for me, just the other day. But my recollection of this film when it came out was the kind of the VFX work was kind of what people were talking about. Not that it was a big hit or anything. It wasn't. But in the context of its release, that's kind of what I remember the discussion being. And there was kind of like the one scene in particular that people kind of remember from this film. If it has any kind of iconic scene, it's when one of the creature's victims is released from its body and stands up with half his head dissolved, but is still alive and still just writhing in pain and agony. And that was kind of the moment I think that most people take away from this film. So the film stars Treat Williams as John Finnegan, who's like a 1990s take on Alan Hale Jr.'s character from Gilligan's Island. He's a skipper for hire. Pretty much a don't ask, don't tell policy. Just pay him the money and he'll take you wherever he wants. So he gets hired by Wes Studi, who plays a character named Hanover, and he's hired Williams to bring him and a band of men, who he's obviously the commander of, to a location that he's not really disclosing what exactly is there. And like I said, Williams, as long as he's getting paid, doesn't really care. The destination, though, turns out to be a luxury cruise ship on its maiden voyage, filled to the brim with extremely wealthy passengers who have tons of jewelry and other valuables in the ship's safe, which Studi and his men plan to ransack. But when Williams and company arrive at the cruise vessel, they find that it seems to be almost completely devoid of human life, and that there's obviously been some gruesome violence which has occurred aboard the ship. And it's not long before they do find a small group of passengers who have held up in safety, including the ship's builder, the wealthy Simon Canton, played by Anthony Heald, who probably many remember him as Dr. Chilton from The Silence of the Lambs. There's also the ship's captain, played by British character actor Derek O'Connor, Captain Atherton, and also a lovely young woman by the name of Trillian St. James, played by Famke Janssen, who is actually a wanted criminal who goes about these cruise ships, these voyages, so that she can pickpocket and break into safes. And of course, she's a lovable criminal who we know will be our leading lady. And it's some of these survivors who inform Williams and Studi and the rest of the gang that the ship has actually been attacked by human-devouring, bloodthirsty creatures from the depths of the ocean, which have infested the entire ship. And compounding the problem is that in coming up to the ship, in approaching the cruise vessel, Williams' own boat became disabled when it struck a lifeboat. So there's no way to escape via that craft without executing some repairs. And as part of the mission to raid the ship that Studi has, he's actually been in league with someone on the vessel itself, someone who initially we don't know the identity of. And that person has completely shut down the ship's communications and ability to move. So our cast of characters basically find themselves trapped for the meantime with them, these sea monsters, these sea creatures, ready to pick them off one by one, with seemingly no way out. Now, for me, pretty much up until the early mid-90s, it's difficult to watch any American film and not walk away with some degree of satisfaction or ability to get something out of it. Because even though there are highs and lows throughout that entire era of film history, from the silent era right up till then, in terms of what I prefer by way of aesthetic, there are some eras I prefer more than others. Usually, any section of time that you pull from that, 70 plus years of film history, there's going to be something at the very least that I'm going to enjoy about any film from that rather large piece of time in cinema history. I'm going to either enjoy something about the aesthetic, the visuals, the set decor, the costuming, the way it was shot. Even if I don't like the movie, even if I think it's not a good movie, I'm going to walk away with some degree of satisfaction, even if it's very small. I'm not going to think like, oh man, this was a complete write-off. But going into like the second half of the 90s, again, this is a subjective thing, as all takeaways on film are, but it becomes harder to have that relationship with the film. I think especially in the last half of the 90s, going into the early 2000s, visually, just film and television, not completely failed on an aesthetic level, but there was definitely a greater struggle, especially on television. I think that's one of the, not that there weren't good shows being made at this time. Of course, this is the seeds of the renaissance of television were being planted with stuff like The Sopranos, but at the same time, I think that you look at a lot of the popular shows from that era. They're shows that it's really difficult to even get past the aesthetic. If I was to list off all the popular TV shows of that era, whether it's anything from Walker, Texas Ranger to Babylon 5 to Star Trek's Deep Space Nine and Voyager, Jag, or any of the sitcoms at the time like Seinfeld, and to me it was just, especially on the small screen, a rough era aesthetically, visually. I don't think the big screen suffered as consistently, but it was definitely a problem for them, that section of the arts as well. And I think Deep Rising definitely kind of falls into that pot for me. It's a film that I am not really able to take away much on a positive note from its aesthetic, from the style in which it was shot to just the basic look of the sets and the cinematography, which is not to say that the people involved weren't talented, but it's just the eye they had for this movie is not an eye I appreciate. It's not something that I think carries much strength to it or much visual appeal. The visual appeal doesn't have to be beautiful in any kind of traditional sense. It just means it has to have a strong design to it, a striking, stylish aesthetic. And kind of like one of the first things I'd say right off the bat about Deep Rising that struck me is, it's shot in scope, but really doesn't use that ratio to any kind of advantage. The scope image, which if you're not familiar with that terminology, if you're watching a movie and it's got black bars in the top and bottom of the screen, even on your wide flat screen TV, that's basically scope. So it's an aspect shooting in scope, and there are a couple different aspect ratios for scope, a few different ones. But shooting in scope, you're kind of taking advantage of the wider format of the big screen. But this film, even though there's plenty of opportunity, you have to do that with the locations of this film. They're out in the ocean, or even when they're in the ship, you have these large spaces like the ballroom and even the various catacombs of like the engine works with all the pipes and hissing and stuff. But a lot of times the angles are pretty tightly around the cast. It really doesn't try to communicate any greatness of depth or size to the locations the characters are in. You got to wonder why they shot it in scope if they weren't going to even kind of utilize the strengths of that format. The movie runs just under 2 hours. It's like an hour 50, hour 48. And if there were just a handful of memorable shots in the movie, that was about it, really. That was about the max it hit. And like I mentioned at the beginning of talking about this film, one of the things that's remembered about it is its visual effects work. And this is, in a broad sense, the early days of CGI. Obviously, CGI had been used as far back as the 70s. But it's still early on. But at the same time, though it's early on, it's still several years after Jurassic Park. And my whole take on CGI, I mean, I love practical effects, and I believe that practical effects are the way to go, if at all possible. There are some things which are beyond the capabilities of practical effects. But I think that, something tangible generally comes across better, and a great place for CGI is to enhance practical effects and to augment them, to be used in tandem with them. But there are obviously some things which it would just be impossible, essentially, for all intents and purposes, to do with practical effects. And at this point, like I said, in CGI's history, because it was still in its infancy, utilizing CGI was something you really shouldn't do at this point, unless you are working on a Jurassic Park level, where you have a director like Spielberg at the helm who can command the top talent and the biggest budgets to execute his vision. Jurassic Park CGI work still holds up to today. It's extremely well executed, and it's still stands as some of the best CGI work in terms of forwarding a film's plot, and also just standing up over time. But Deep Rising wasn't able to command that level of CGI work, and I don't know if that's just because of for budgetary reasons or uh, the whoever was involved talent wise, or just a combination of factors. But this is an example of CGI work that really has not held up over time. Perhaps when it came out, people were impressed, just because, like I said, CGI was in its infancy, and people were just so amazed at whatever it could do. But it's definitely a weak spot in the film. It stands as a really good example of using CGI when you're really not equipped to. Using it because you can, but again, just not really taking a step back and saying, do we want to use CGI to execute our creature design and some of the other effects work? We're able to, but do we really have the budget and the resources and the vision and the talent to do justice? Or should we just go about this a different way? Or do we need to, for example, say it was a budgetary reason, do we need to scale down the use of CGI so that when it is used, it's used to stronger effect, or more time and energy and craft is able to be put into when it is used, because it's being used more sparingly. Now, this film struggled with its effects in post-production, directed by Stephen Sommers, who after this, the next movie up that he would do would be The Mummy, which would be a big success, of course. But this film was in post-production for a year, and Summers has talked about how he never had experienced anything like that before, and it was exactly because of the effects. The original effects team just couldn't bring to life what he imagined, and so they had to bring on another team, and that's why it took so long to get this done. But when you watch the movie, I mean, the creature effects, I mean, first off, the design itself of the creatures wasn't really, in my opinion, that impressive. It kind of seemed to borrow a lot from other works. It just seems very typical of kind of monster design work of that era, and even kind of the time that's followed it. You know, a lot of rows of teeth and tentacles, and nothing that really burns into your brain in the way that you think of with like the alien xenomorphs or the predator, these kind of like iconic creatures that had been designed in the preceding 20 years. This film really doesn't have anything that kind of leaves you with that lasting impression in terms of its a sea creature effects. But also, just again, the CGI work that is on hand, I want, it's not bad, because there is definitely films being made at this time on much lower budgets that really exemplify what bad 90s CGI work looks like. But it's just more about the fact that what they wanted to bring across with the CGI and what they actually were able to bring across with it are just have too far of a chasm between those 2 points. And you watch it now, and perhaps I would assume it would have been the same back then. There's no sense of menace or threat to any of the characters in the film, because the creatures, whenever you see them, you're always taken out of the film by the fact that they are just so obviously CGI work. In fact, the most impactful death scene in the movie, I won't give it away who it is or what it was, but it doesn't even involve the creatures. It involves a person on person in a fire axe, and it is by far the most memorable, probably actually the most memorable scene in the movie. I think it's the scene that's most effectively done, and it has absolutely nothing to do with even the main horror-based impetus of the film. And of course, aesthetic is just part of the battle. You also have the film's narrative, the film's characters, and so Summers, after this, where Summers was in his career, he had come off doing a couple films for Disney. He did the live action The Jungle Book, which had come out in 1994, and a year prior to that, the Disney release of The Adventures of Huck Finn with Elijah Wood. And like I said, after this movie, he would do The Mummy Returns, and then Van Helsing. And it's been a while since I've watched those Universal monster movie reboots that he did with Brendan Fraser and Hugh Jackman. But at the time I saw them, even though I don't think there are any classics of the genre, and I have problems with them, at the same time, there is kind of like this sense of fun to them, which works especially because they're period pieces. The Mummy movie set in the early 20th century and Van Helsing in the late 19th century. And I think to a degree that's kind of one of the reasons, especially like the Mummy movies, are kind of were able to gain some traction is because they're almost kind of looked at as like this, not on the same level of quality, obviously, but this was almost like a B movie version of Indiana Jones with a little more horror thrown in. And so there's a lighthearted touch, a sense of humor to those movies, which does have its moments of effectiveness. And you can kind of see the origins of that or premonition of that in this film. It definitely tries to go for some of that kind of same, you know, uh, wisecracking in the face of a danger humor, especially between like Treat Williams and his engineer, Pantucci, played by Kevin J. O'Connor, who this would be the first film he did with Stephen Sommers, and then would go on to appear in just a number of his movies he did afterwards. Probably best remembered as the villainous cowardly Benny in The Mummy. But that type of humor doesn't really play well in Deep Rising, partly because I think that, well, partly just straight up, it's just not funny a lot of times. It's interesting because when they originally went to make this movie, it had a larger budget, and they wanted the Treat Williams character to be played by Harrison Ford. And they approached Ford about it, and he eventually, turned it down. Once he turned it down, the budget was lowered, and then Williams was, eventually brought on board. But the character that Williams played, it's just like so obviously based off the Harrison Ford archetypes of Indiana Jones and Han Solo. I mean, right down to him literally saying, "I have a bad feeling about this," and a lot of the other throwaway lines in the film are of that same ilk. And on one level, I think it's done, deliberately. It's kind of a tip of the hat to those kind of characters, but at the same time, even though it's done with good intentions, it's not done with the same effectiveness that was executed in the Star Wars films and other stuff that Ford did. I mean, the writing in this film is just not on that level in terms of being able to create these memorable one-liners or creating moments that are able to really bring a really good punch of humor in the midst of suspense. A lot of times it just comes across as dialogue that's trying more than it's accomplishing. It's trying to create this ambience in the film's narrative of lighthearted action action comedy, but because it keeps trying to bring that point home without actually landing, because they keep throwing out these one-liners and these stressful situations that just kind of fall flat and aren't really that funny or memorable. It just ends up being a constant reminder of just how much this film isn't one of those films, how much this movie is not a Star Wars movie, and Treat Williams' character is not a Han Solo or an Indiana Jones. But I think on another level, I don't think that was even the right tone to even try for this film. Again, with like the Mummy movies, there's this kind of throwback sensibility to like Indiana Jones, where it kind of makes sense that you're gonna kind of go for that action adventure humor mix. But Deep Rising, I think that the attempt to kind of keep injecting some levity into the proceedings, it kind of reminds me of a broader problem with trying to mix comedy and horror. Roger Corman talked about how he liked to put horror and comedy together because you have these really tense moments for the audience, and then the humor would kind of help offset that, and then you'd be able to build back up. But I think mixing horror with comedy is actually one of the really most difficult things to pull off effectively. A lot of people try to pull it off, but I don't think it often works. I think that it's best when it leans really heavy in one way or the other, when you have a really strong horror sensibility, but with doses of humor in it. Maybe a moment here or there where you just maybe lighten things up a little, or the flip side of that where you're really dealing with a comedy film that has kind of horror plot elements to it, like The Little Shop of Horrors, for example, would be a good reference point for that. But when you're trying to kind of keep the balance even, which is kind of like what they try to do somewhat in Deep Rising, they're really mixing three genres. It's really it's science fiction / horror. It's an action movie, and then you have this humorous element thrown in. But I think that in a case like this, where you're trying to balance out the humor more with the action and the horror elements, you just end up weakening the film as a whole. Again, not so much because you're trying to balance out with action. Action comedies are, you know, have been around since the dawn of time. But when you're really trying to balance it out with those horror movies, it ends up just kind of like underpinning them and taking out the sense of fear and terror. If your main characters, the people you're with, are never feeling really that afraid, if they're able to kind of keep wisecracking no matter how bad things get, then it kind of takes away from your sense of any real terror going on in the proceedings, which again is already a problem I have with this film because of like the CGI and the monster designs. I'm already not really buying these creatures as really that frightening, and then when I see the characters kind of laughing in the face of death, it kind of takes away from that even more so. I think this film would have had a much bigger punch if they had just gone all in as like this dark, foreboding movie. I think that would have been really interesting to see them tackle it with that tone. It would have required a different director. That's not really Summers' forte, and would have definitely needed someone else at the helm. But I think that would have been a really much more effective way of handling this. Speaking of the characters, like I said, we're already having issues with the CGI kind of kicking some of the supports out. We have issues with the dialogue kicking some of the supports out from what's supposed to make this movie effective. But then the characters, especially the characters of Wes Studi and his men. Studi, like I said, he is this basically mercenary for hire, named Hanover. And he's got this, his men who come with him to raid the ship. And it's actually a rather interesting cast on hand to play his men. You've got Cliff Curtis in there, Trevor Goddard, who is Kano from Mortal Kombat. Got Daimon Hansu, which this was right as he was hitting it big. Amistad, although it came out before Deep Rising, had actually been filmed afterwards. Of course, like I said, Deep Rising was held up because of the post-production. So this is kind of like one of it was probably the last role, I believe it was the last film he shot before being brought on board to Amistad, which was, of course, the beginning of the incredibly successful career he's had up till this point. But these mercenary characters are it's that classic cartoonish, completely unbelievable group of thugs. There's nothing about them that makes you ever believe that they could really be effective in combat. They're constantly pissing each other off. They're constantly pulling out guns and cocking guns. This was kind of like in an era of this level of B filmmaking where they really weren't putting their actors through the ropes in terms of just even having them move like a mercenary, a soldier, or anybody with any kind of military experience would move. It's just kind of like unbelievable that they've even had any training in combat or any kind of experience. I mean, I think of a film like Predator and Schwarzenegger in that as Dutch and his men. I mean, there was definitely a sense of a small sense of that larger than life nature to his men, and not just in terms of like their builds, like him and Sonny Landham and Jesse Ventura, but also just their personalities. But at the same time, those characters had this grounded sensibility that made them believable. I think part of that was especially the way they reacted to the Predator in the film, where you could see that even though they were battle-hardened men who had seen a lot, there was also a sense of a fear about the situation they were in. And the mercenaries in Deep Rising are basically the ultimately dumbed down version of that. It's like if Predator was made by Merchant Ivory at the highest level of filmmaking, and then Hanna-Barbera did Deep Rising, which I love Hanna-Barbera, by the way. I'm just saying, though, you know what I mean. If they did it, it's like they really brought it down to its most cartoonish level. You might as well have had the Hair Bear Bunch, I guess, as these mercenaries in Deep Rising. And it's also a film that I distinctly remember this about this era of the 90s. This fascination with not just guns, but like big, fast-firing, rapid-fire, somewhat unbelievable-looking guns that you weren't sure, is this a real gun or they just designed this for this movie? And I think that's the Terminator 2 impact, the Terminator 2 effect because of Schwarzenegger with the minigun in Terminator 2. everyone's like, oh my god, we all got to have something like that. And I remember you had like Eraser around this time with Schwarzenegger, which is all about this specially designed gun. You had the Men in Black, where Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones sporting these huge guns, and they have the specific type of machine gun that they use in this automatic weapon they use in Deep Rising. They even take time to give it its own moment and talk about it and how it can fire and all this stuff. And they're just constantly shooting it at any moment, even when it's completely unnecessary. And that just kind of adds to the cartoonish nature of it. Also, the fact that it shoots a ridiculous amount of rounds, but you never once, I don't think in the film, see anyone reload it, or even any idea how they could carry around the rounds for it. I mean, the film is kind of aware of this in some sense. There's a tongue-in-cheek moment where some of the mercenaries fire off a large amount of bullets because they think there's an enemy about, and after they realize there is no enemy about, they just think it's really cool that they shot that much, so they just continue to fire some more. So there's a sense that the film's aware of it, and I'm sure there are people who find that kind of humor and the humor that Treat Williams has, like with Kevin J. O'Connor, things like that, part of the appeal of the movie. But again, for me, it's another a notch against it. If you're going to have characters who have kind of like that cartoonish sensibility to them, or not even characters, but situations which are unbelievable to that kind of cartoonish extent, then I think that you have to do that with us. Again, it kind of goes back to the beginning of this review. You have to do that with a sense of style. You have to bring style to that, because if you leave it on its own without anything visually to support it, what you're left with is just a bunch of stupidity on the screen. Dumb characters doing dumb things in situations where we're supposed to believe they're in peril, and we're supposed to be concerned about what could happen to people. And when you have this on hand without any kind of style to it, then you're just left with nothing to really engage with. You don't care what happens. Whatever does happen, you don't even believe it. There's never any sense of really being concerned about what's going to happen next. And kind of an example of a film that had these, you could argue, had some of these narrative issues, some might say, but that it doesn't matter. The film's still a great movie. Is Cobra with Sylvester Stallone. I mean, the villains in that movie, if you haven't seen the film, it's from the mid-'80s. Stallone plays a cop who's trying to protect Bridget Nielsen, who's a witness to this murder carried out by a group of serial killers who, I mean, that film has, you could argue, is far worse on a narrative level than Deep Rising, because the villains in the movie, it's a group of guys who meet together, and women who meet together in a sewers, and sometimes of them dress in business suits, and some of them look like they've been sleeping in alleys, and they're going around murdering people and causing mass violence just because they think it's going to bring about some kind of non-specific new world order. There's really no detail given to what makes these people tick, why they're doing what they're doing, how they started, who they are. And you know what? You never care, because the film has so much style to that movie. That movie has become iconic in terms of being representative of everything great about that time period of the 80s. The neon lights and the everything went down, and Stallone walking around with a matchstick in his mouth and the aviator sunglasses. I mean, it's a film that you look at, like Drive with Ryan Gosling, and how his character references back to Stallone. So there's a film where you actually enjoy the fact that it's so shallow in detail in terms of the villains and their plans, because it just kind of plays into the whole visual concept of the movie. That's almost like this music video of violence and destruction. But with Deep Rising, again, they probably have it's a more developed narrative, a more developed plot line and characters, but still not developed enough. And what you're left with without the style to serve as any kind of skeleton or any kind of backbone to everything else the film has to offer, then you're just left with a movie that you don't really care about, and characters you don't care about, in a situation you don't care about. Cast-wise, it's interesting because this film has a lot of good performers in it, but even they're not. I don't want to say they're not bringing their A game, because I don't know to what point. You never know with a film. If you have a really reliable performer in a film, and the performance they're giving is of the same caliber as they usually do? Is it because they didn't come across effective, or is it because they were directed in a certain manner? You don't know, but like, yeah, I like Wes Studi. I mean, like I said, the guy just got an honorary Oscar just a couple of years ago. Not a really good performance in this movie. It feels very artificial. Um, Treat Williams definitely comes across better than a lot of the other people. And I like Treat Williams. He just sadly passed away not too long ago. Not a bad performance he gives, but it just seems fatigued. Is the word I would kind of put to it. I think the person who comes off the best out of everyone is Famke. Famke Janssen. But she's given so little to work with. It's she's kind of playing. I feel like she's playing a B movie version of like a Julia Roberts character, and of course the red hair kind of helps sell that too. I mean, and as for the cast members playing the mercenaries like Hunsu and Curtis and whatnot, it just seems to me, and for them, they're being given these characters that they're supposed to be playing as like these steroided gun-toting goons. I don't really fault them for their performances as much, because I think that was probably more the direction they were given for that. And I'm not trying to be negative about the film. I definitely don't regret watching it, but just to continue my shitting on everyone, music scores by the great Jerry Goldsmith, who is one of the most legendary composers ever, Academy Award winner, whose work I love. And I have to say, like, it's probably the worst Jerry Goldsmith score I've ever heard. And I've heard a lot of Goldsmith scores, and I don't really know that I've ever heard a bad Goldsmith score up till now. I had no idea. I don't know if I just missed his name in the opening credits, or his name wasn't in the opening credits. But I was listening to it, and I was like, wow, who'd they give for this music? This is really highly unmemorable. And realizing that it was Goldsmith at the end, that was a rude awakening. But I mean, like I said, I love Goldsmith's work. Everything from Planet of the Apes and Star Trek: The Motion Picture, and I mean, just goes on and on. Even like Tora Tora Tora, not one of his better known scores probably, but really good. That was rough. So the movie, when it came out, when they had launched plans to do it, there hadn't actually been, Stephen Sommers talked about, there hadn't been like a good old-fashioned monster movie in some time. And so this film, they finished shooting it in 96, with plans, I believe, to release it in 97, maybe early 97, before everything happened with the special effects just going to hell and them having to kind of extend post-production into a year. So by the time the movie did come out, they had movies like The Relic and Mimic, these monster movies, get released in that interim. And most threateningly, probably, Titanic came out. And that film was released, had its U.S. release on December 19th, 1997. Of course, we all know it became the most successful film in history up to that point. Stayed number one at the box office till April 98. And in between December and April is, unfortunately, when Deep Rising came out. It was released on February 2nd, 98. So in between the time that they had finished shooting the movie and actually were able to release the movie, you had these monstrous movies come out. You had this huge juggernaut of a film wiping everybody out of the competition. But not only that, Titanic is a disaster film about a cruise vessel. So that right there kind of, takes the wind out of Deep Rising sales. It's kind of, even though Deep Rising may have been intended to come out way before Titanic, it looks kind of like this, ends up looking like the B-movie monster ripoff of Titanic, even though that's not what it was aiming for. So with a budget of $45 million, Deep Rising only ended up doing a little over 11 at the box office, the U.S. box office, which is rough. That's a really rough takeaway. Fortunately for Sommers, of course, rebounded right away with the Mummy, and Deep Rising has gone on to have a strong cult following for sure. A lot of people who love this movie, and again, I have no regrets watching it. And then a big shout out to Kino Lorber, who put this out on Blu-ray. There was a previous Blu-ray, double feature Blu-ray, no extras on it, and then Kino Lorber gave it its own release and just loaded it up with bonus features. They got Sommers to do a commentary track along with the editor. They got interviews with a number of the cast and crew. So props to them for putting a spotlight on it. And I think I'm never going to say don't watch a movie, but it's definitely one of the weaker movies I've seen in a while. And even when I don't like a movie, I can usually say, well, watch it because there's this you can take away from it. This one performance or this one scene or the music or the camera work. But it's difficult for me to point. The thing that kind of stands out to me the most to point out about this film is how it's a great example of a certain type of film I don't like. So it kind of reminds me of that I Love Lucy episode where Lucy's trying to become a writer, and then she gets an offer to have her work published, and then at the very end of the episode, she realizes that her writings could be published in a book about writing in a chapter titled "Don't Let This Happen to You." And I feel like that's what my relationship with Deep Rising. Like, yeah, you should watch this. I would, as an example of how not to do things. But again, that's just my opinion. I never want to come across like I'm like, crapping on some film in a way that's like mean spirited. I didn't think the film was good. I think it wasn't good for all these reasons. I think it didn't bring anything home in terms of its characters, in terms of the story, in terms of its effects or aesthetic, or tone. I think these are all areas where it should have taken a different approach. To me, this movie should have been a really dark. Well, it's interesting because Roger Ebert, in his review, compared it to Alien. It's like basically this Alien ripoff. I think they should have leaned into that. I think that's really where they should have gone with this film. The great thing about Alien, Sigourney Weaver and Tom Skerritt and everyone on this blue collar spaceship and all these shadows and dripping water and grime. And the alien hiding in the darkness and killing them off. That's the kind of environment I would have loved to have seen created in this movie. Like, imagine if it had been like, even instead of a pleasure cruise, like an oil tank, or just done something differently with it being a pleasure cruise to kind of give it that more grimy, grungy feel, and to make it really dark and ominous, and to really bring that strong horror tone, and to kind of forget about trying to make it more of like this action comedy mix put into it. Because I mean, the thing about Alien is it has some really, has some memorable humorous moments. Some of the banter between like Harry Dean Stanton and Yaphet Kotto. But I think if they had gone much more in that direction, and then even maybe used the creatures in a much more sparing way, so maybe they could have relied on practical effects or just, visual effects, CGI effects that weren't just like right out in the open and where you could see all their weaknesses exposed. And had they done this film with that kind of tone and made more grounded, realistic characters, I just think that would have carried the film so much further. I mean, even if you still had issues with Jerry Goldsmith's score or some of the cast members, maybe if their performances were not up to par because of their own efforts or lack thereof. If you still had some of those flaws in the film, just a multitude of sins would have been covered just if the overall tone and approach to the movie had been different and trying to really make it basically Alien on the high seas. There would have been nothing wrong with ripping it off in that sense. I mean, Alien is often pointed to as a ripoff itself of 50s B movies, monster movies, just done with such a higher budget and a strong artistic vision. It would have been interesting if Deep Rising had been to Alien what Alien had been to those movies. But it wasn't. Not in my book. So, hey. But hey, check it out. I mean, this is a film that, this is a Disney movie, Disney-owned property, because it was produced by Hollywood Pictures. So that Kino Lorber Blu-ray, the prior Blu-ray is out of print. The Kino Lorber Blu-ray is officially discontinued. I don't know if you can still pick it up anywhere. But if you can't, if you want to get a hold of this, I would definitely do it sooner rather than later before these all go out of print and fall back into the bottomless pit that is the Disney library, the hell, which is the Disney library where nothing comes back out. Who knows? Maybe it will. But I think that about wraps it up. Deep Rising, 1998. Thank you for checking out this episode of Carpet City Cinema, and anything you can do to keep spreading the good word about this is most appreciated. And we're looking forward to being back next week with reports from the Buffalo Dreams Fantastic Film Festival and Jay's experience there. And until then, take care.